Industrial revolution. Now let me hear from some of you all. What comes to your mind when you think to industrial revolution? Yes, young man in blue jersey.
Modern period shift into a more mechanized system.
Very good. The young lady there in pink. Let me hear. What's going to come into industrial revolution?
It has to do with the rapid economic change in Britain.
Very good. Right, so you are familiar with it. The lady in the brown suit. What's going to come into industrial revolution? What is first things come to your mind?
Machines, rapid change to machines.
Rapid change from what to machines?
Probably hand tools and then machines.
Very good. So you all have a basic idea about what is the industrial revolution. Now, let me explain further what this means, and I will try to give you an example that you might understand. You all know the movies, The Matrix. What was The Matrix about? The machines taking over, right? And humans trying to fight with the machines, right? Now, you have other movies like Transformers. What was Transformers about? Machines against humans. Right. So these, you see this is what Hollywood did. They talk about this man versus machines, Transformers or Matrix. These movies. This is what was happening to many people in Europe. They became afraid of change. So not many people welcomed the Industrial Revolution. People began to fear that machines would take their jobs. People like the farmers, the shoemakers, the bootmakers, manual laborers began to fear that this revolution that was occurring in Britain and the rest of Europe would take away their employment, would create unemployment, would create poverty. So I want you to understand that the same fear that we see in the Hollywood movies that machines are taking over the world, it was this fear that was also present in Europe in the 19th century, right? It's a fear of these machines. So when you hear the term Industrial Revolution, it's the introduction of mechanization, the introduction of machines on a widespread scale, large scale, and there's also the acceptance by some persons, but also the fear by many people, the uncertainty that these machines might take away their jobs, right? And there were other fears too that we will come to talk about. So you all are correct about your explanations, your definitions of the Industrial Revolution. In the second half of the 16th century, there was an increasing scarcity of wood. There was a high price of wood. What did they use the wood for? For fuel. Remember, it's a cold climate in Europe, and you need this wood for fireplaces. You need this wood to run the trains, to create fuel for these trains. And many people began to use coal as a substitute. You see the same coal they used for barbecuing? People began to use this as a substitute for fuel. In the 17th century, industries such as brewing, where they make beers and things, industries such as the brewery industries, brick making, and glass making switched from wood to coal. So it wasn't just normal families and households, but it was also these larger industries, brick making, brewery, all these were switching from wood to coal. to increase manufacturing, to lower the cost. Between 1603 and 1604, between 1603 and 1604, there were wooden rails. You know the rails that the trains run on? There were wooden rails being built during this time, early 17th century, 1603, 1604. And by the 1790s, rails were made of cast iron. By the 1790s, rails were made of cast iron. Speaking of cast is up here, these are heavier iron, cast iron. And with this cast iron, heavier trains could be built and more products could be put on this train. Right? And that they didn't have problems of the wood breaking or the wood splitting or anything with these cast iron rails by the 1790s. By the 1830s, you had wrought iron. By the 1830s, the rails were made out of wrought iron. Right? So you see this change from wooden rails to cast rails to wrought rails for the trains to run on. The cost of items were reduced. The cost of items were reduced because it no longer meant that items would have to be carried. The cost of transport, cost of items were reduced because it no longer meant items would have to be carried via ships. You now could use railways. Items are moving faster across Britain, across Europe. So more items are also being transported, so the cost declines because of the volume that could be carried through these railways. Any questions? Everybody understand this, right? About the Industrial Revolution, right? It's an easy topic. Britain's economic growth. Britain's economic growth was at a maximum during the 1820s and 1830s. Britain's economic growth was at a maximum during the 1820s and 1830s. Right? An economic growth. At certain areas in Britain experienced population increases because of the Industrial Revolution. Certain areas in Britain experienced a population growth, a spurt. For example, Manchester. Manchester, spelling is up here. Manchester, some of you all know that these terms, if you're following football on it. Manchester population increased from 20,000 persons in 1760, 20,000 persons in 1760 to 164,000 persons in 1824. 164,000 persons in 1824, right? So 20,000 persons in 1760 to 164,000, right? Is a fairly big increase. And this was because of the growth of the cotton industry. This was because of the growth of the cotton industry. What do we use cotton for? What did people use cotton for a long time? Or did they use it to make cotton candy? For clothes, for cloth, right? It was a very important commodity in Europe at that time, cotton. Britain, part of the Industrial Revolution, in which Britain benefited from, was the invention of the decimal converter. Part of this Industrial Revolution is the invention of the decimal converter, which allowed revolutionized the manufacturing of steel. Bessemer converter, which was invented in 1837, revolutionized the manufacturing of steel. Right?
So, when you, about the cotton industry, right? What are they using? Using the spinach jenny itself, or they use?
We're using the spinning jenny, right? That's one of the inventions that helped with the use of this cotton. But what I'm showing you is the transport of the cotton and in development.
But the spinach jenny was the main thing.
The main item used to make the clothes and to make the curtains and clothes and things. She asked a very important question, and that is the use of the spinning jenny. And that was like a simple sewing machine, right? That was used to make these looms of cotton into clothes and things, right? It's one of the important inventions. Any questions then? The improved steel as a result of this Bessemer converter, this improved steel was used for rails and machines. This improved steel is used for rails again for the train, and also for machines in the factories. Some historians have argued that the Industrial Revolution was not really far-reaching. Remember just now, I think one of you all said was widespread. Some historians have argued that in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was not as widespread as it should be. And one of the historians is L.C. Seaman in his book, Victorian England. One of the historians, L.C. Seaman, in his book, Victorian England. I believe it is in your reading list, right? The spelling of the author and the book is up here. And he argues that agricultural workers domestic servants, agricultural workers, domestic servants, bootmakers and shoemakers were all affected by this industrial revolution, but it hardly transformed their work and lifestyle. So Seaman is making a very important point. Agricultural workers, bootmakers, shoemakers, right? They are not really affected by this grand industrial revolution. All it might be is that the cost of leather might be cheaper. The cost of buying a shovel or a spade might be cheaper because the cost of iron go down. But their life has not changed. They are still in the rural area. They are still in a certain wage, right? This is what Seaman is arguing, that it wasn't really widespread as such. Some historians have argued that it is dangerous to generalize about the widespread impact of this revolution in England and Europe. Some historians have argued it is dangerous, it is misleading to talk about the widespread impact of the Industrial Revolution because it wasn't so widespread as such.